Once again, I would like to invite our guests to come inside the ballroom so we can continue with our next section. Thank you very much.
Wait a minute, that's the
Don't
moderator.
drink my coffee, man.
That's the moderator seat, Phil. That's the moderator seat. Unless he's going to stand at the podium.
Oh, I don't know. I don't care. I can sit. It's just for the introduction, right?
There we go.
How do the others do it? Do they stand or they sit?
Oh, they all.
I'm gonna sit. There's a clicker here.
There's testing.
Welcome back, everyone, and we will continue our section. It's a dialogue on DNS operational best practices. The panelists will discuss how such practices are essential towards strengthening the DNS infrastructure and explore how the APAC community can better work with the global technical community on this aspect. And with this section, let me introduce our moderator, Mr. Phil Regno, President on DNS-OARC, to lead us for this section, and the panelists will join him. And the floor is yours, Mr. Regno.
Well, here's a microphone. Well, thank you. Very happy to have been invited to chair this session. And I kind of like make the regular joke that we're finally going to be able to talk about DNS instead of domain names. but that's kind of, it's always difficult to find a shorter name for the labels that we all love. So one thing I'm going to do is, if I have a screen here, I should be able to, there were some slides I wanted to bring up. And can we have the slides on the screen? Just for a quick introduction about this session and the panelists. Thank you. So, next slide. Can I go previous slide? No, okay. Well, anyway, just to give a little bit of context. So I'm at the DNS-OARC, which is the Operations Analysis and Research Center, which is an organization that's been around for a little bit more than 20 years. Originally born out of ISC, we are now an independent member organization that has pretty much anything to do with DNS operations. Our members meet twice a year for conferences and workshops and talk about DNS operations and research. And some of the people here on the stage and in this room are members, and some of you probably already know about a little bit about DNS-OARC. If not, well, you can read up about that. This is not a presentation about OARC, but we've got software developers and researchers and operators. And so we have a quite unique community of members that represent really the people running the DNS on the internet. And joining me today, next slide. I guess the clicker doesn't work, so I'll just say next slide, please. We've got here today, we have Juan Vuti from DNNIC, DNS specialist and systems administrator. And we have Shampika Vijayatunga from ICANN, working as the senior manager for the APAC technical engagement team. And Imran Hossain from iHost in Bangladesh, ISP and hosting, also registrar, yeah. And Philip Peps over here from the University of Oregon's Network Startup Resource Center, who does a lot of training and engineering assistance around the DNS, among other things. And finally, Jim Galvin, who we've had the opportunity to hear on various questions and comments this week from the ICANN board's SSAC. And so the thing we want to talk about today is what, best current practices. So I'm not going to frame the debate other than say, what's the best current practice? We have recommended operational guidelines that operators agree to follow. And this is true for any kind of industry. It's not just for the DNS. It can be the medical world. It can be the aeronautic industry. This is all about recognizing things that are of value and actually make a positive difference. Next slide. So the question is, of course, is how do those BCPs emerge? And that's another question we'll be talking about. Mostly, they're commonly agreed to by operators. They have some kind of value that actually makes a difference for your operations. They have an impact, a positive impact usually. They're driven by policy sometimes. If any of you are following all the regulations emerging in the European market in terms of NIS2 CRA constraints about cyber resiliency and diversity of your infrastructure, those are also going to drive your best practices. And sometimes those policies are going to be influenced by what the experts are doing, meaning that there's a kind of a feedback loop here. And finally, you have other operational areas, manners being one of them when we're talking about the internet, that has an impact on, say, the DNS in terms of network resiliency. Next slide. So there is an existing BCP initiative we'll be talking about, which is also kindness. We have two people on this panel, Shampika and Philip, who can talk about a little bit about kindness. And there are other entities who are also trying to develop and promote best practices around DNS. One of them being RIPE's DNS Resolver BCP Task Force, which is also has ongoing work around authoritative BCP. So we're going to see some of that as well. Next slide. So DNS-OARC's role here, the reason that I guess we've been invited to chair this is we have so many operators and software developers and also researchers on our in our community that when I started at OARC here about 1.5 years ago, I thought, well, the community is active, but we don't have a voice in this space yet. And I have a disclaimer, I was involved in the kindness initiative with my previous hat as an independent contractor. And now we want to see, can OARC contribute to this? Can we have a discussion around BCPs? And therefore, we're inviting as many of the operators to come forward and try and volunteer for this kind of BCP evaluation initiative. The idea being to evaluate what's out there of BCPs and see if we can contribute, validate, and maybe possibly retire also some generally accepted current practices that maybe don't have the expected impact. And of course, we want to collaborate with the researchers that can measure the effect of these BCPs, because not everything is something you can easily evaluate. So again, when we talk about evaluating BCPs, we want to talk about the outcomes that are expected and how do we make them measurable and what do we collect? And again, who's going to be doing this collecting and from where? That's pretty much it for the introduction. I don't want to say more. I think from here on, we have, of course, going to have some questions from the audience later. I wanted to start with some guiding questions and maybe ask some of the panelists here what they perceive to be a BCP, what's a good BCP, and maybe some examples from your various experience and expertise. And also, what BCPs, do BCPs apply, best current practices, do they apply to everyone, or are there different roles in the DNS ecosystem that warrant different kind of best practices? So I don't know, let's start with, I don't know who wants to take the first question, maybe Jim. What would be a measure of a useful best current practice, and do you have some examples of that from with your background?
I think the way that I think about best current practices is, first question I like to ask myself is whether or not it's solving a problem that I have. And I think that's kind of important. Best current practices run an important spectrum from just an ordinary low-end user. Well, I'm trying to find the right phrase, but as distinguished from our root server system and also distinguished from a TLD system. I think that best current practices that serve the needs of the security and stability, resiliency, SSR of the internet at large, and the higher you are up in the tree, the more important your best current practices are, because you're looking to ensure that the community at large, the internet at large, is well served and gets the services that it needs. So I think that DNSSEC is an important component of services at that level. So the specifications and all of the guidance that we get around ensuring that TLD and the root zone is signed and has those facilities and services available is an important thing. And maybe for the moment, I'll end on the notion that ESAC, coming from that point of view, is in fact just beginning to enter into a dialogue for itself, provide some advice to the community on the role of DNSSEC in our community at large. So I think there'll be more to say about that coming forward. Now, you asked me for specific examples of BCPs, but I think I'll let others who are more directly involved in that to offer that. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Interesting discussion to be had about DNSSEC, whether DNSSEC is a must for everybody. I think there was a good nuanced answer on that. Maybe from some of the people who are actually working, in the trenches, either Juan or Imran, talking about, say, what are some of the BCPs you consider to be, I would say, primordial or critical to infrastructure? What are the things? Yeah, you want to cover that, Juan?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be invited to speak here. My name is Juan and I'm from Vinic. Yeah, as you know, the DNS system is essentially the internet directory that connect user to websites just like any other DNS system. Our DNS infrastructure also faces common security and operational risks, including DDoS attacks, DNS spoofing, configuration, operational errors, and many other risks. And first are DDoS attacks. We just overwhelmed system capacity. We implemented BCP 38, IFC 2827 for ad network traffic filtering. Second is DNS spoofing, such compromise user data addressed through BCP 230 with DNSSEC for data authentication, and operational errors from human or hardware factor mitigate through strict ISO 27001 compliant for process duration. And besides the risk, there are many other risks as well. Recently, we have been facing increased risks, including ransomware attacks and natural disaster impact such as storm and earthquake. This risk threat not only system stability, but also data security and organization reputation. That's why implemented the preventive measure is absolutely critical. Yeah, last year in Vietnam, ransomware attacks against financial institutions and enterprise surged dramatically. In response, we implemented a triple-layer backup protocol. Firstly, daily backup of all critical information, such as system configuration, domain records, DNS key. Secondly, multi-format storage using online, offline, and centralized system. Last but not least, always maintain copy in isolated devices. This comprehensive approach ensures rapid system recovery capability even during increasing-based cyber attack. And in light of recent catastrophic events, including devastating Myanmar earthquake last month and Typhoon Yagi in late 2024, we have significantly strengthened our disaster preparedness framework to safeguard critical DNS infrastructure. And this incident underscores the urgent need for robust contingency planning. Our comprehensive approach now with particular emphasis on 4 key phases of our business continuity plan as known BCP2, including prevention, preparedness, recovery, and response. To validate this measure, we conduct regular large-scale drills. This end-to-end preparedness strategy not only mitigates operational downtime, but also reinforce trust in our infrastructure resilience, again increasing bilateral threat landscape. Thank you.
I just want to make a little comment here. If we listen to a lot of the BCPs that were cited here, including BCP 38, it sounds like operationally, not a lot of the BCPs that were mentioned were specifically about DNS. They were about sound operational practices issued from other areas. And this is interesting because when we talk about DNS BCPs, there's a question of scope. How far do we want to go? Is the DNS content subject to BCPs? You know, resolvers are impacted by the actual data they have to deal with. So this is an interesting ongoing discussion, is how far down the systems route, how far down the BCP as in business continuity planning we have to go. And that's an interesting, again, dialogue to have. So maybe I could ask either Shampika or Philip to talk a little bit about the Kindness Initiative and how does that, how do you think that prepares operators today with regards to DNS operations, and what do you think, some examples of the BCPs, and maybe some examples of BCPs that haven't been retained and why not? Why are some BCPs not always a good idea or not considered BCPs by all?
All right, yeah, thanks, Phil. Maybe I can go and then can go later on. Yeah, so there were quite a lot of discussions here about the BCPs, the best current practices. Now, first of all, we have to think about that. We are talking about the domain name system, right? We have to think about the whole ecosystem. So there are quite a lot of players, and that is why we call it as an ecosystem. So we have the root server operators, we have the authoritative server operators, the TLD operators, and so on. And then we also have the resolve operators. Then we have the registries, registrars, and all that. So it's a big ecosystem. So our main objective here is to protect the DNS. So from that perspective, we have to apply all these best practices, considering the perspectives that we were talking about. If you are a registry operator, there are certain best practices. If you are a resolver operator, there are certain best practices, and so on. So we have to think about the big picture. Now, from the BCP's point of view, just Phil did mention about, there are various practices. So I specifically want to talk about this framework, which is what we call the kindness. So the objective of kindness is, or in fact, actually, when you say kindness, it is a big acronym. It stands for knowledge sharing and instantiating norms for DNS security. That's what the kindness really means. But then when you think of kindness, we are talking about number of best practices that we apply depending on the type of, say, the operations you do. If you are a resolve operator, there are certain best practices. If you are an authoritative server operator, there are certain best practices. So Philip was asking about some of the examples. Say, if you think about, say, DNSSEC. Now, when you think about DNSSEC, there is DNSSEC signing, then there is DNSSEC validation. So when it comes to DNSSEC validation, it is important for resolve operators. When it comes to DNSSEC signing, it is important for the authoritative server operators. So based on what you do and what your scope is, you can think of these best practices. And especially even earlier, Juan mentioned about the BCP 38, which is again, very important when you think from a core network point of view, how you're going to get traffic into your network and how you're going to get traffic out of your network, things like that. So this is where, again, it really complements with manners, which is again, the routing security best practices framework that we are talking about. So all these are best practices that we try to do from the perspective of securing our infrastructure. And DNS, of course, in this case. So I hope that is the objective of the BCPs that we want to highlight here.
Okay, thank you for that. And maybe somebody who also works in the trenches actually implementing some of those BCPs. I see Philip over there doing work with a lot of CCTLDs around the world on behalf of the Network Startup Resource Center. Maybe you have some comments on that.
I do. So many comments. So one point I want to raise is the C in best current practices for current practices. And it's important to remember that the DNS is not a static ecosystem. It evolves over time. And over the last 30 years or 20 years, we've learned a lot of things that seemed like a good idea at the time, but turned out not to be a very good idea upon reflection. DNSSEC is one of those things. DNSSEC is great for validators. I think validating DNSSEC should not be optional in 2025. So the kindness guideline for DNSSEC is you must, DNSSEC is not optional, you must validate. The kindness guideline also says, you must, as an authoritative zone, you must sign your zone. But I'm not sure if that's always the case. Right? It's not black and white best current practices. Depends on what area you're in. And the kindness guidelines try to reflect this reality on the ground, that it's not always black and white. You must do this, you must do that, you must do that. No, it's more of a should. You should do this, you should do that, you should do this. And depending on where in the tree you are, the shoulds start tending more towards musts. As you go higher up the tree, the root obviously must be signed. GTLDs, popular CCTLDs, once there's a certain value inside them, they must be signed because it becomes more and more important for the overall security of the system. But there's always going to be a long tail where DNSSEC is not the largest problem to solve. And the best current practices framework tries to capture that reality. That, solve the most important problems first, and then as you get through them, go and tick the other boxes. Or, well, they're not boxes to tick. They're things you should keep in mind and do. It's not an audit exercise. It's not ISO 27001. Kindness does not try to be something your auditors go and check you on. Kindness is something your operators put on their screen next to them and go, we've got a fairly good working CCTLD here. We've got a pretty good registry running here. Our DNS servers are running and everything looks okay. Let's look at kindness and see, are we ticking all the boxes? Are we doing everything right? And that's where the current comes in. It's the best current practice. The current is not only the current place in time where we all are, but also the current place in space and time where a given organization is now, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. That raises another question, which is if not all, I mean, okay, so there's a question about not all entities everywhere in the DNS, I would say tree, or in their respective roles, whether they're authoritative or they're resolving, need to implement all BCP. So the question is, of course, there's a question of relevance. You don't need to validate, well, you should validate your own zones if you're signing them to make sure you've done it right, but your primary function is to sign authoritative zones. So my question is, why wouldn't you want everybody to say sign their zones? Or why wouldn't you want everybody to run an anycast? Not saying it's a best practice, it's an architectural choice, but what would be the arguments for not adopting all the best practices if they're the best ones? And you mentioned that higher in the tree, so there's a question of importance. The reason I'm getting to, what I'm trying to get at is, you know, things get complex enough, there's enough requirements. I wouldn't call them compliance because that's the trick. We don't want to force compliance on people, but if an operator is asked to do too many things, maybe what we're telling them in the end is they maybe should be outsourcing it in the first place and saying, I shouldn't be doing DNS, it's not my core business. Is that where we want to end up at? Or are we trying actually to move competence back into the operators?
So I want to come back to the comment that I had made when I first responded to your question about a BCP. I think that what's important here, I resisted giving examples of particular BCPs precisely for the reason that you just gave. As we listened to each of the speakers, beginning with Juan and everyone, they all had a different perspective from which they were asserting what was the BCP from their point of view. I think that the real question here is, what problem are you trying to solve? Okay? As you are higher up in the tree and you are an authoritative server, there are more things that you have to do because it's more impactful if you don't get it right. And so you're going to invest in a greater number of important methodologies, important mechanisms to ensure that you maintain a stable and resilient and secure service. So not all best practices are applicable to anyone. Take a simple case of BCP 38, Anycast. Well, BCP 38, ingress and egress, about managing your systems. Anycast, not everyone needs that large a service. If you are providing services for a very localized set of people, you don't need a global system. You don't need global access. So maybe an Anycast kind of service is not important to you. You don't need that level of service. But if you're a TLD or you're a root server operator, that's critical. I mean, it's simply an essential thing for you to do in order to get that kind of visibility. So I think that's what's important here. There are a lot of BCPs, and it occurs to me then that now that's when we have a gap. I think that kind DNS is going in the right direction, right? So it's going in the direction of these are the best practices, these are what they're good for. What we're missing is, on top of that, how do you know which best practices are appropriate for you? And if you're looking to help people with that, that's an interesting dialogue. But there's no, you know, standing guidance on that kind of issue. You have to figure it out for yourself.
Just before I hand off to Philip, I was going to ask Imran, because I mean, you're a hosting company, you're an ISP, so you probably have a perspective on this. You're trying to balance, you know, making a living and implementing measures that will keep your business running in case of, well, you know, natural disaster, annoying I was reading in your slides or in your notes, misconfigurations from the customers. How dare the customers give me data to serve? Oh, and it has to be correct, right? Yes, your CNAMEs, your name server should not be CNAMEs, things like that. So what do you think of this? I mean, what do you, from the kindness perspective, which just have actually some recommendations for operators like you, what do you think? What's your takeaway on all this?
Thank you. Actually, DNS is the technical things, and we are in this ecosystem, like we are making money from this DNS. So we have to make the money from the customer if the DNS is up. So like we are actually contacting with the customers. So sometimes like most of the customers has the access of the DNS. So say they actually can misconfigure anything, and they comes to like they did some bad, and then they're saying like, oh, we're not receiving email, but their email server is up. But sometimes like they change some DNS configuration, and the DNS server has some errors, but their web server is up. But you understand. So always we have to be proactive. So our BCP means like we always be proactive, and we always give some guidance to our customers, like how they should work on the DNS server, or like we always insist them to help our guidance. Our technical team always giving some supports to them. So we in our case, like we always work on our some standalone services. So we have our own system like that. We work separately. So we make our own SOP for the giving the best services to the customer, like because we are offering email services, hosting services, that depends on the DNS. So we focused on DNS first. So our BCP means like we are in this ecosystem like customers, our resellers, and our internal teams. So we have our own SOP and we give some guidance.
Thank you. That actually, and this is going to be for you, Philip, I think you just mentioned two things that are really important. To have a stable business, you have to engage in a capacity building function, even more so than a troubleshooting function, because if your customers are not working, their perception is you're not delivering service. I mean, the answer is it's always the DNS, right? There's one thing, there's a kind of altruism which is rooted in, well, we want the internet to work and therefore we have to help each other. And so I want to turn that question to Philip to talk a little bit about your experience, with going out and helping out all kinds of network registries, research and education networks in this capacity building and BCPs. And what's your take on all this? What do you think?
So before that, I want to pick up a little bit on where Jim went, is not all BCPs are applicable equally. And one of the things I like about the kindness guidelines is that it neatly breaks up the ecosystem both horizontally and vertically. It says, the kindness guidelines, you could ignore the text completely, but if there's one nice little diagram on the kindness website that just breaks down the ecosystem into top-level domains, SLDs, and resolvers vertically, and then horizontally, depending on how you turn your head to look at the world, it divides the world up into from less critical to more critical, or everything's critical, from less impactful to more impactful. If you are a small local ISP, you are less impactful than if you are dot. So I like that about the kindness guidelines. It divides the applicability in a way that works neatly. And then to pick up on Imran's points, DNS is only as good as the data people pour into it. At the end of the day, the point of the DNS is to serve the data that people have put into it. So if people are going to put nonsense in the DNS, the function of the DNS is to serve that nonsense faithfully. And when it comes to making money, I think it's on the hosters to try to shield their customers from making the worst kind of mistakes. So there's little things you can do. Validation. So one of the things I see with distressing regularity in some of the CCTLDs I help out is I see CNAMEs where CNAME should not be, MX record should never point to the CNAME, and other little things that should be fairly simple to catch at the application layer or when data are being entered into the DNS. If you're, if some of the things I do is I help sign CCTLD zones with a small number of delegations, and then I go and look at, what's in there, and I find things in what should be a delegation-only zone, and I find CNAMEs. So, it's, and again, this changes at different levels of the delegation tree. If you're a hoster, if you're mostly second-level domains and third-level domains, you can enforce some kind of data hygiene on your customers. You must point an MX record at a name, at something that ultimately becomes an address. Those are easy things to do. If you're a CCTLD, you're in a slightly worse position because what's in your zone is what you have put in there. So you need to go back in time and talk to all the 60 and 70-year-olds who created the zone file and ask them, hey, why is this in here?
Thank you. Thanks for the input. The talk about data hygiene raises two interesting questions. And one of them you said about, helping customers or setting the bar maybe for the customers. Registries sometimes historically have had requirements on having at least 2 name servers for various obvious reasons. And of course, the first thing that some people would do in a hurry was just, okay, I'll just put IP 17 and 18 on the same subnet with 2 name servers. And oh, darn it, no, those should be on 2 different networks. And then, those requirements kind of added up. And so until you got your name delegated, you had to fulfill a number, you had to jump through a number of hoops, which would typically only be verified once. And anything beyond that was kind of up to you. So, and of course, there was a question of, who gets to set those? I mean, when there's a contractual relationship, that's completely different. But who gets to decide in the end, who are those, what are those best practices? Why are they important more than others? And if they're only verified once, the question is, how do you make sure that you don't fall into the trap of having, through network consolidation, suddenly all your name servers are on one network? That's one thing. And the other thing is interesting, the DNS has that in common with IP, that there's no out-of-band signaling to resolve things. There's no IP carries its own, routing information, and therefore the DNS has the same problem, is that you can, the data you carry is actually impacting the operations. It's easy to shoot yourself in the foot, as you said, with CNAME. So in terms of standards, I mean, people talk about a DNS camel. There's the joke is also that at one point there'll be one too many standards, and right now there's ongoing efforts with Deleg to introduce yet another way of delegating things, which is supposed to simplify the DNS. But the way it's going, the DNS looks to be more and more complicated. It's more and harder to navigate. At the same time, it's extremely forgiving until you sign with DNSSEC, and extremely, resilient to failure. So there's a kind of a paradox there. And the question is, how do we expect, where should people go to find out what's the best way to deploy DNS so they don't feel disgusted and feel like I'm just going to find an operator to run my DNS for me because this is way too many things I have to track, right? And that's my concern. And our concern also in the DNS operator community is, how do we make sure that this doesn't consolidate into fewer and fewer players, the market being what it is, so that people still feel like they should be running and need to be running the DNS themselves, maybe because it's a core business, but also because it gives them a little bit of, what you call it, independence, or rather sovereignty over their own services and their own data. So where should they go? I mean, is kindness the place to go? Are there other places? And who's going to be questioning kindness and making sure that those policies and recommendations are current? Who's going to revise them? Who's going to chime into that, right? That's the next question. Yeah.
So doesn't the answer to your question depend partly on what perspective you're coming from? So the question here is, are there operational best practices that should apply uniformly to anyone at all times everywhere? Or are there best practices that apply to you, and then maybe you have a different set for your customers and how you deal with them? I mean, I was struck by Imran talking about having to deal with his customers. If they have a DNS problem, he has to step up and help them, because the DNS has to work for things on the internet to work. And so, that's the first line of defense for the average customer. I look at a registry, Juan was talking early on when she opened, with all of the things that she does on the registry for herself. But what does she do for the next level down? What do you do for your customers in the DNS, which I presume are registrars? Do you have access to retail customers? But I think we all have that question. And I agree, there is no single source for where to go. Kind DNS may be a start, but now you have the problem of, how does anyone know about Kind DNS? Where did they find that? Okay, so there's still this gap of knowing what's appropriate to you and how you find what's appropriate to you. Everybody solves it differently. I'm interested in how those who have to deal with the service. So I am interested in Juan's experiences as well as others. Thanks.
Okay, and well, yeah, there's a bootstrapping problem here, finding out where is kindness so I can set up my DNS correctly. And yeah, well, sometimes, I would say use a search engine and ask them. And interestingly enough, I've tried ChatGPT and asking, is there a best practice initiative on the DNS? And most of the time, he was able to point me in the right direction. So that there's some hope, as long as your DNS is working. So another aspect that we were talking about as among panelists is also, we were talking about a little bit about DNSSEC. Maybe talking to Nick, a guided question. When you implemented DNSSEC, were there things that you were not doing that you had to do as a result of deploying DNSSEC? I mean, it probably made your life more complicated, you know, key management, signing. What best practices or what initiatives, some people will say you need NTP, you will need HSMs, all kinds of things. What things did you have to change in your operations to implement DNSSEC? And at the end of the day, did it make you better prepared, or is it only annoying? You know, I don't know. Do you have any questions, comments?
Yes, before deploying DNSSEC, we spent a considerable amount of time for researching and studying the technology from various sources. And the preparation included repeated testing. However, even with careful planning, the implementation of DNSSEC still had a significant impact on our infrastructure. From a technical perspective, DNS substantially changed how the DNS system operates. Packet size increased due to additional security records such as DNS key and secret. This caused many queries to switch from UDP to TCP protocol, leading to an increase of about 20 to 13% in traffic and processing resources. The DNS server faced great pressure due to cryptographic operation requiring upgrade to CPU, RAM, and especially network bandwidth to handle traffic spikes. To address these challenges, implemented by several measures simultaneously, double network bandwidth to avoid overload when handling large packets, deployed automated key management to reduce risk during rollover key, upgrade hardware with high performance server and high bandwidth connection, establish a monitoring system to provide early warning when DNSSEC record approach operation. Another challenge during DNSSEC deployment is eDNS0. An extension protocol support large DNS query. In practice, many exit network systems still struggle to handle eDNS0 packet, leading to DNSSEC validation errors. As a result, end user may experience domain resolution failure. To resolve this, we had to upgrade network infrastructure, open UDP TCP port 33, and optimize configuration network to handle large DNS responses. Additionally, training DNSSEC operators is crucial. I observed that more DNSSEC incidents occur during the DNSSEC rollover key phases. This highlighted the importance of closely monitoring key and record operation schedule, and conducting carefully testing before putting any changes into system. This precaution significantly reduces the risk of serious errors. In terms of processes, we added 3 main incident response procedures. Number 1 is handling key load failure, applicable only to the DNS signing server. Number 2 is recovering lost signature or DNSSEC records using related to the DNSSEC signing server key 2. And last one, responding to major incidents such as server failure or natural disaster, as I mentioned above. We will switch to the disaster recovery center in Ho Chi Minh City. Our technical infrastructure is designed with high redundancy, especially Specifically, the domain management and DNS-SEC signing server follow a geographically redundant model. The deploy of DNS-SEC enhance the security of DNS infrastructure, but also require significant investment to infrastructure, personnel, and operational processes. That's in my answer.
Well, thank you very much for this. And I think the last thing you just said was really relevant because I'm happy to hear. Considering something like DNS-SEC definitely makes you question your infrastructure, makes you question your processes. And I think without having to necessarily feel like everybody should be signing DNS-SEC, the requirements it puts on your infrastructure are worth considering simply to find out, am I doing things the right way? If an incident happens, how prepared am I in terms of offsite recovery, in terms of disaster? It's not just a matter of switching a primary to a secondary. It's a matter of having the key material. It's a matter of having the right timekeeping. It's a matter of having the right network configuration. And you're not the first, entity that I talk with who says, it complicated our lives immensely, but we don't have a choice. So thank you for that. At least that points in the right direction about having a set of best practices for that. The one thing I also want to ask about is now that people have, kindness and, RIPE is working on these BCP initiatives, and at OARC, we're talking about getting operators together and software vendors as well. They have something to say because the best practices become protocol changes or default configurations. Who is, kindness was started 2-3 years ago. Who is going to be qualified? Who is able to contribute to kindness? What is the process for updating those best practices? And it's great to have a single place to look at. We just identified some of the shortcomings of best practices is that they're a little bit everywhere. So you tend to turn to your neighbor and go, what are you doing? Oh, you're signing your DNS-SEC with 30 days. I'll put 30 days as well. Nobody knows why it's 30 days, but everybody's doing it. Turns out if you're going on vacation, it's better than 2 days. And that kind of stuff. So in the end, you end up doing what the neighbor's doing. And there's also this risk, what I call cargo cult best practices and network, which is I'll do what everybody else is doing because it seems to work. And I think sometimes maybe the risk of some of the best practices initiatives, they become fossilized, and that's the whole current thing. And we predicate this is how you should be doing it, but who challenges these things, and which forum, and how do we make sure that those assumptions are challenged and that they become up to date? And that may be easier for Shampika or for Philip. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point, Phil. I will take a very simple example actually to elaborate that. So usually when I speak to engineers, normally I ask them to check, okay, what are your DNS servers? And then we do a check, okay, these are your name servers, and we check the IP addresses. And then we see that all these DNS servers, just like exactly what you say, they're all in the same subnet. And okay, then we ask, okay, why are you going to put all your name servers into the same subnet? And then they would say, okay, this is how we have been taught, and then we are doing this. And then, there are lots of issues, right, over there, exactly. I mean, you should not be putting all your name servers into the same subnet. But even I've seen that people, okay, they would put that into different subnets, but still they're all in the same rack, right, physically, or they're in the same data center. Okay, so these are the things that actually, when it comes to practical situations, you can always go into different sort of, extend, and you could put in, you can apply your best practices in different levels. You could, if you want, you could put your name servers, maybe within your country, or if you want some even redundancy, there are situations where the submarine cables have got cut and the whole country was affected. So you can put your name servers outside the geographical locations. These are all practical situations. So when to the point that you ask, okay, where should we check all this? So again, I would come to kindness, because kindness would give you, it's a tool where you could do all these checks. So you can see exactly what you are doing now. Is it right? Or are you, can you improve this further? Can you apply some better best practices? So you could do all that in kindness, and depending on the operator type that I was talking about. So if you are an authoritative server operator, if you are a resolver operator, you could check on the current things, what you do, and then apply the best practices, and you can further improve or enhance your infrastructure, basically. I would say, from that perspective, you can always use kindness as a tool to enhance your DNS infrastructure.
Okay, that answers that part. And maybe Philip, you want to comment on the other part?
I wanted to comment on fossilized in particular, because Juan said, she implemented DNSSEC for .vn and eDNS0 reared its ugly head, and a lot of traffic fell back to TCP. About 20 years ago, well, actually probably 25 years ago, it was a best current practice to go and filter UDP port 53 traffic, and any packet larger than 512 bytes was suspect. That was a best current practice at the time. DNSSEC comes along, and your DNS traffic, eDNS0, you have buffers of 4K is an exceptional case. But if you're in the middle of a key rollover or an algorithm rollover, you might have very, very large responses, which need to ideally go out over UDP. But if you've got a 2000s Cisco PIX sitting in your network, looking at every UDP packet going through and seeing, port 53, 512 bytes, goodbye, your DNS is not going to work very well. And that's where the fossilized or fossilization of best current practice comes in. A standard or a best current practice is only as good as how current it is kept. And I have no good answers to this.
You're all, oh.
Just one
No,
point,
go ahead,
Phil. Yeah, you did mention earlier about the software side of it. So I want to touch that as well, because there are lots of organizations, they use the same DNS software across all your name servers. This is also not really a good, good practice, because if there are some vulnerabilities with a certain DNS software, you could affect all your DNS servers. So always you could think of probably, having some variations, having that diversity. So you could basically reduce the risks as well, especially from a software point of view.
It's interesting because now we're crossing into two different territories. One of them that Philip was mentioning about eDNS0 and filtering shows that some DNS people still work in a silo. They're in the DNS space and they don't necessarily talk to the network people. Restricting access to your resolvers, is that a network function? Is that an access list on your name server? And in smaller organizations, and I'm pretty sure at iHost, you've got people who probably have several hats on and they have the benefit of being, I won't call them full stack, but they're the people who understand the network and the DNS. And this is also one of the challenges in our industry, is we have less and less people who understand what's happening from the application down to the packet, right? And that means that some of those things go unnoticed until the day you deploy DNSSEC and you realize you have a static configuration from 20 years ago. So there's need also for better dialogue, and the DNS is impacting so many operational areas. If anything, talking to RPKI consumers, if anybody signs their prefixes, their announcements, sorry, then you might be looking at your validator through a domain, through a host name, and then your DNS needs to be working. So there's really that need to be cross technology. When you're doing a DNS deployment, you need to talk to various people who don't only do DNS. And the only thing about software diversity, that was actually a really interesting point when I was involved in Kindness, was what was the intended outcome? Because if we're talking about, monoculture and the risks of running the same software everywhere, some operators want that resiliency, but they don't want to do it through software diversity because they thought it makes my life more complicated to have to hire engineers with 3 different specialties. I'm going to need a Linux guy, a FreeBSD guy, and a guy who knows bind and NSD and not. And one TLD, which I won't mention, said, we don't do this. We have a first row of DNS servers on one part software, and we have a standby set of name servers we can switch in with just a prefix announcement into another software. So basically, shark have multiple rows of teeth, and it's a little bit the mindset. So different approaches to getting the same kind of, if there's a 0-day exploit or a mitigation, a vulnerability with no mitigation, having the operational preparedness to do that is significantly higher than running different types of software. But we can't tell operators how they should, qualify and how many people. In some ISPs, you'll have one person doing everything, right? So it's also presumptuous sometimes to ask people to have that level of competence. Yeah.
So I think this gets back to the question of what problem you're trying to solve and where you're trying to go. We keep saying DNS and we're talking about DNS operational best practices. And you started to suggest that, we could have a silo talking about DNS. But the reality is, if you're going to run DNS services at a high level, okay, you do need to know about other things. You do need to know about IP addressing. You do need to know about routing. You do need to know about infrastructure. As Juan talked about, you've got bandwidth issues that change as a result of doing all of that. So you've got traffic analysis that you have to deal with. Now you have to run a time server in order to do these things, really carefully. I observed that, but those sets of things are not for everybody, which is what you get to again. My employer, my day job, we run a 100% service delivery on DNS. We've been doing that since 2006. Never had a problem. But there's a huge investment that it takes to do that. You don't run a global infrastructure with that kind of service delivery without investing in a lot of things, in a lot of pieces. And so you have to have people around that know it. Or you're just going to have a lower level of service and you're going to meet a particular type of need. And I think that's the question. You always have to ask yourself, what is it you're trying to achieve? And then you look at the risks of either side of that. What happens if I don't meet it? Do I have to invest more in order to make sure I meet it because I don't want to meet that risk? As a TLD operator, as Juan talked about discovering, you have to make a greater investment because there's just more things that you need because you need to make sure that it works and what you're up to.
Thank you, Jim. We have about 9 minutes left, and I know we're going to take questions either from the audience or from the online. I don't see questions online. So I have one more question I want to ask because there's a lot of best practices, and again, it can be overwhelming. I'd like to ask Imran, are there things that you looked at in terms of best practices where you looked at them and you said, I don't need to do this? There's a joke, I don't know if you know the joke, there's a gentleman walking down the street and he's got this spray and he's spraying behind him and everybody's asking, what are you spraying for? It's an anti-crocodile, it's crocodile repellent. He says, but there's no crocodiles here. He says, you see, it works. And sometimes it's the thing that we do things without necessarily understanding why we do it. And there's, diminishing returns, and there's of course exposure. And sometimes you don't know until you've done a risk analysis, whether you're actually going to be impacted by that until you're impacted by it. And then it's called disaster recovery. So I just wanted to ask you, Imran, were there things that you looked at where you thought either I don't need to do that, or they don't need, or this is kind of not a best practice, or I don't see why I should do it? This goes to what Jim was saying about different levels, different requirements, but are there things where you thought, not it's stupid, but this doesn't make sense, or I don't really need that? Was there any situation where you were there thinking, I don't need to do this, even though it says it's a best practice?
We actually, as a small hosting company, we always focus on the same category of same type of software, same type of technology, and we lack of skilled people. So we always go on the small practices. That practice we always do. We don't want to explore more. So we always keep our side this is okay. Our customer service is up, then continue the same services. Don't explore more. So this is actually what we actually avoid in our BCP. So we always focus on our existing ecosystems.
You apply critical thinking, which is, and you make sure that you don't, but again, and this is also the problem, as Jim was saying, if you're a small operator, deploying DNSSEC or maybe deploying HSMs, if you don't have a lot of community scrutiny, might be overkill or might be decidedly a problem, especially when HSMs expire or they die or you realize you can't do offsite.
Yes, if I want to say one example, we try to implement DNSSEC to all of customers, and all hosting server and all domains user will be used a DNSSEC. But it could not we could not implemented that because of we have some dependency on the local ISPs, and I know these two guys already knows our Bangladeshi situation. So they set up the IPv6 and then like after 20 days or 10 days, it's not working. So we cannot depend on any other new technology because what we understand, the ecosystem in our existing technical teams, like the ISPs and the data centers, so they actually following the existing rules, not the new. So like we did some experience, like we request some ISPs like please set up all IPv6 to these servers, and then we set up everything and it's working fine. And some later suddenly we see that it's not working. So what we understand that they actually did something changed in their side, like their core system. So our IPv6 is not working, so our DNS-SEC is stopped. So these things has happened. So we avoid this.
I think, for the people who don't travel to Bangladesh very often, this is a common theme in infrastructure, in .bd in particular. You try to implement DNS-SEC, but then you discovered that BD is signed, but com.bd is not signed. So what do you do as a hoster? As a hoster, you might want to follow best current practices and go, well, I'm going to sign my authoritative records. Fantastic, wonderful. I'm going to do this for all of my my third level delegations, and they're all signed now. You're attracting all of this extra traffic. But what's the end result? There's no net improvement to the security of the ecosystem because there's no top-down validation chain that works, because there's no DS record for com.bd in the BD zone. And you can't put a DS record in the com.bd zone because they won't take it.
Oh. The other is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just wanted to give a little bit of context because it sounds like you're trying to do the minimum you can get away with, but that's not true. You're doing what you should be doing, but you're constrained by the environment you're in. You as a hosting provider, you can only do so much. You can't go to the operators of com.bd and say, hey, our customers want DNS-SEC, and I can't put DS records in. You only have, and that's both the beauty and the tragedy of the DNS. Nobody is in charge. Authority is delegated, and you only have control over the branches of the tree that have been delegated to you. So if you're sitting on a third level branch, there's not much you can do.
I mean, there's one thing also we haven't talked about, which we won't have time for, which is, our BCP's driver of business adoption or competitive advantage. Remember, everybody said DNS-SEC was going to be the killer application and not the application that died. But, and we saw some CCTLDs who were very much in a hurry to sign, or just TLDs in general, and then didn't proceed to accept DS records from the child delegations. Well, you only did half the work. No, we were told we had to sign. And then everybody proceeded to buy .com domains if they wanted DNS-SEC, which kind of goes against the purpose. Again, it really depends what you're trying to achieve. I don't know that we'll have much more to talk on the panel. I just wanted to check. I don't see any online questions. I may be in the audience. There are some here. Was there somebody from the industry who's coming forward to the microphone? If you have any questions or comments about this session or something we missed.
Yeah, thanks, Michele from Black Knight. I suppose my real comment is, this seems kind of upside down in many respects, because you're talking about best practices as if they were a driver for operators. And I think unless the operator is a not-for-profit that doesn't actually have to make money to pay salaries at the end of the month, that's just not reality. But the reality is that you might use the best practices because you're trying to solve a problem, but you're not going to adopt the best practices because you get brownie points. And the reality is that as a host, we're a hosting provider, we're also a broadband provider, and we're a registrar. Now, obviously, I like the idea of being in business. I like the idea of my customers being happy. So I will do things in order to get to that. So some of these best practices might feed into that, but they're not an end of them in themselves. And I think some of the standards that various entities have tried to kind of push on both registries and registrars are absolutely ridiculous. And it's nice to see that the way people are talking about, for example, DNSSEC has now evolved. Several years ago, as you noted, there was this rush to implement DNSSEC. And anybody who doesn't know should know that DNSSEC is the most unforgiving, badly designed software ever. I mean, as a concept, it's terrible. I mean, the idea behind DNSSEC that you have all the validation is great, but the way it works is just disastrous. And you saw issues, major issues, because people were told, oh, this is the golden standard, but they weren't told, if you screw this up, you will kill the domain. You'll kill your zone. So I think it's nice to see that evolution, but I think you have to keep in mind that realistically speaking, you're trying to make things work sanely. And I think the context of that is very, very important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And yes, and the worst thing is when you screw up your signing, it's the people who resolve it who are going to see the error. There was a story about that, and it ends up being the ISP who does validation that is the one being criticized. We've seen that before. Thank you very much for your comment.
Rubenski, Unique.pr. After seeing how hosting providers, mostly small and medium hosting providers, dealt with denial of service attacks, I ended up coming with a best practice that I want to know if the panel thinks is too depressive or too paranoid, is for them to not run DNS servers at all. Because if you look at web infrastructure, they can protect it very easily and cheaply using network-based web application firewalls, while they can do that for DNS authoritative servers. So I say, don't run your DNS server, go to someone else, which is not usual thinking from emerging economies where mostly one people does everything at all instead of relying on contracting services from other providers. But I end up accepting that this would probably be better for them. So am I too negative in this?
I have a comment. Where are you? You're in Brazil.
São Paulo.
So, yeah. You're a big country with a big ocean and a lot of submarine cables. One of the CCTLDs I help a lot is a landlocked country with at least 30 millisecond latency to their nearest handover points. So if you're not running your own DNS servers in this particular economy, you are punishing each of your users with 30 milliseconds per query in the best case. That's just the resolver. So if you point the resolvers to, say, one of the usual suspects, quad 1, quad 9, quad 8, whatever you have, you're punishing each individual query with at least 30 milliseconds just to get the query to the resolver. Just bringing that in country takes that down to 10 milliseconds. So it's, again, best current practices are not universally applicable, right? So as Jim said earlier, different current practices are differently applicable. If you're in a big country with an ocean with very nearby access to a cache or very nearby access to authoritative servers, that works fine. If you're landlocked or if you're a mostly mountainous country with lots of Wi-Fi links, all that latency adds up. And at the end of the day, your customers, I think you mentioned you like happy customers. How happy are your customers going to be if you punish each of their queries with 30 milliseconds on a good day, right? On a bad day, the traffic ends up 2 countries away and it's 60 milliseconds. So just keep that in mind.
Well, and it comes down to if you're a very small ISP, I think we were in South America last year and we were talking about Colombia as having 6,000 ISPs. Now the definition and the metric for an ISP is also very different. Some of them might just be reselling DSL locally or over Wi-Fi, and a lot of WISPs. And the question is, what's cheaper? Getting a network engineer to properly set up your DNS service or pointing everything to quad 8 or quad 9. And that also, is a business choice. And then of course, again, it's a matter of priorities. You want your customers to be happy, but you'd rather be using your money somewhere else. So I wouldn't say it's depressing. I wouldn't call it cynical. I'd say it's a realistic business consideration that everybody had to. And Michaela's comment about things being upside down when you're in the business of making money, and I have a past hat as an ISP and building my own provider, you definitely do the things that cost the least time with, the highest trade-off and satisfaction. If that means outsourcing your DNS to somebody else, especially when it can be free, you do it. It's just a no-brainer. It's only when it becomes critical enough that you want to be in control for either geopolitical or for, availability considerations that you start to think about bringing it home, at which point it might be too late.
You also need to think about what the whole problem, because you say, yeah, you're in the business of making money and it's cheap. It doesn't cost you anything to point your DNS to someone else. But what you're doing is you're making your customers pay for it with time.
Is that a tariff?
Well, time
Millisecond tariff.
time equals money. So you're externalizing the cost by making your customers spend more time.
We kind of ran out of time. So the question is, at this point, if I understand correctly, I don't know if there's any other last comments from the panelists to add to this. And if there's any general takeaways, is best practices are a good thing, but use your critical thinking and don't necessarily believe that you have to implement everything it says, right?
I can add one last thing about the kindness. So if you are a DNS operator, you can do a self-assessment, how you're doing with your current infrastructure. And so you can be anonymous and you can get a kind of, understanding of what you're doing now. And then if you want to enhance your best current practices, you could do that as well based on the guidelines. Yeah.
And we mean like this is a process. Best practice means it's a process, and sharing the knowledge within the community. This is the best things. Thank you.
Yeah, and last word I want to say is some of the best practices we're discussing are actually become defaults. If you turn on DNSSEC resolver today, it'll try and do DNSSEC validation. So in some cases, some of the things we talk about, QNAME minimization or EDNS0 and all that have become the standards. And in fact, some of the things that are being advocated, it's more a matter of doing a check and making sure you are respecting that standard and your network doesn't stand in the way of it than actually implementing it. So and sometimes the BCP is kind of a due diligence check that you have to do. So it becomes in a way easier, and sometimes, yeah, I mean, requirements change, but not that much these days. I think that's pretty much all. I don't know anything. Otherwise, thank you very much for the panelists for your time and for contributing. Thanks for the audience for listening and for the remote participants. And yeah, I hope that was useful for some of you and that you'll all go home and start implementing best practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, our speaker, for your insightful discussion. That I believe that there's more information that you want to share with the audience today, but due to the time, we have to conclude the section here. Thank you again, and please stay on the stage for the photo together. Please stand at the center of the stage. Thank you again. And now we will have our short tea break before the final section. We're gonna see you then. Thank you.